So Rob, let's start with your current role. Like you are doing all three responsibilities together: CIO, CISO, and COO. How is that playing out? Because it's a lot of work. If you could throw how you were able to manage all the three responsibilities.
It is a lot of work, but it also stems from having a really good team.
Okay.
So I have 6 direct reports in order to help me manage all of them. As it stands right now, I'm over all of IT, all of cybersecurity, all of physical security, all of DevSecOps, platform delivery, shipping and receiving, facilities, do government property management, procurement, audit, and compliance.
Wow.
And I have 6 direct reports that are directors reporting directly into me in order to handle all of those areas.
Right. So which of these three responsibilities you find more demanding?
Demanding changes from a week to week basis.
Okay.
Just depends on the objectives of the company. So some days, say we're looking at expanding into new facilities. Well, contracts and the facility side is going to be significantly more demanding than the others. We could also be going through a government security audit at the time, in which case security and compliance are significantly more demanding than the others. Generally, there's just one that's demanding every week, maybe 2. As long as I can keep it so that all of them aren't demanding in a single week, it's controllable and it works fairly well.
Right. COO responsibility normally is not just IT, but way beyond IT, right?
Yes.
Whereas
it is a good
CIO and
bit beyond IT.
Yeah. So since you have you come from a lot of IT background, you have done a lot of CISO roles. CIO is very natural, but CIO, which goes way and above IT, how are you able to handle that? Because many other departments come into play.
There are a lot of other departments, but my education, my training background is also beyond just security and IT. I have my standard MBA. I have a concentration in business model disruption. I do advisory work for boards on the side and different other board of director type facilities and responsibilities. It plays in fairly well. It's also interesting because little bits and pieces of responsibilities that feed in from other roles tend to play from time to time. So growing up, my father did construction. I understand the facilities areas. I understand the build outs and the construction projects that we need to do. I rely heavily on the director that reports to me in that area to function them, but I already understand them really well because of that background from my childhood. The rest of my career, little bits and pieces would come in. I'd have one CISO role where I would also do DevSecOps. I'd have another CISO role where I would also do shipping and receiving. And it just depended on the needs of the company. And after enough of those over time, they kind of pile up together where there were only a couple of areas. I think it was government property and procurement were the only areas I didn't actually have previous experience in handling in the past.
Yeah, no, coming to that additional board responsibilities that you are handling, right? As such, these three roles make more than 100% for any person, and you are still able to manage, allocate time for other board responsibilities, which if you could throw light, how you are able to manage even these additional responsibilities.
Well, time management is important. I also have a family, which has a good amount of time management that's associated as well.
Right.
I live by a calendar. The calendar dictates everything, and I make sure it's up to date and that it runs appropriately. Beyond that, it's delegation and making sure that you have the right people that are working for you and getting involved where you need to get involved and stepping away where you need to be stepping away in order to make sure that you can handle all of it.
And do they come anywhere like conflict of interest? Because I'm sure there are areas that you have to take care. How does it work out? Because, yeah.
So once you get to a certain level within an organization, conflict of interest tends to not be as much of a thing.
Okay.
Because theoretically, if you start talking about the issues of conflict of interest between the CISO and the CIO, those responsibilities, even if you separate them, still come up to the CEO. At which case, do you argue that the CEO has a conflict of interest because he's over the security and the IT functions?
Sure.
Really, it just depends on where you have the delineation within the company.
Okay.
As long as you're not malicious in what you're doing and you are operating in the best interest of the company, of the community, and of the people that are working for you, conflict of interest doesn't tend to come in very often unless you are doing something you really shouldn't be doing, and then you probably shouldn't be in the role to begin with. So it ends up playing out fairly well.
Right, right, right. And how is it working with the government agency, especially that to defense, which is very, very critical, and probably security plays a lot of role there. Uh, Prior to this, I presume most of them are private organizations, corporate companies, whereas most of the work now, while your company itself may not be government, but you deal a lot of work for DoD, Department of Defense. So how if you could throw light, what does it really take to work with DoD or DoD kind of companies? Because there's a lot of things which it's not as straightforward as working for another corporate company, another corporate customer.
It isn't. It's also not the first role where I've had those responsibilities. I was a CISO at a company where it was necessary for me to get my clearance.
Okay.
The main driver there is going to be being able to get a clearance. You literally cannot do the work unless you are able to obtain a security clearance within either the country that you're in, and in this case, the United States.
Okay.
The work's fairly similar for other countries with their defense organizations as well. You have to be able to gain a clearance in the country of origin in order to be able to do that work. Beyond that, it all falls out pretty similarly,
Okay.
other than you have a different regulatory body that is kind of monitoring over you and checking behind you and running your compliance against you. And it's even different amongst different government agencies. There's not a single regulatory body. For example, the defense industry has a different one than the FBI, than the White House, than the Congress. They all have different bodies that do that particular piece. So, and they're all going to have slightly different rules and slightly different things that they're looking at. So it ends up playing in very differently depending on exactly who you're servicing within the government.
Right.
But a lot of it is very similar to following SOX compliance. A lot of it's very similar to following PCI compliance. There's a little less leeway, maybe. Compensating controls aren't generally accepted nearly as much. But the policy, the process, the way it's handled, all of that is pretty much the same. The stakes might just be a little bit higher.
Probably very high. So a lot of GCCs or delivery centers here for banks, they have an exclusive unit that they need to walk in. They cannot take that laptop back home. They cannot connect into those systems. And people work only in those premises as long as they are working on the bank's work. Is that similar to that when you work for government agencies?
Yes, depending on the work that you're doing. There'll be different levels of work, and there is work that falls under those exact same rules, potentially even stricter than that.
Yeah.
And the setup runs identically to that when you have those. The major difference is there's going to be a lot of delineation between the work that's required to be done that way and work that doesn't have to be done that way.
Ah, got it. Understood. And revenue grew from 80 to 120, but the important piece is you were able to contribute or measure. You drove profit to grow 30% in almost less than a year. How could you make that possible? Just much less than a year, probably 9-10 months, right? At the most. How are you able to achieve that, Rob? I mean,
from my standpoint, it all has to do with optimization, restructuring for growth, putting in as much automation as possible, and making sure that policy and procedure is set and is ironclad. And this isn't the first company that I've come in to do this. It's if it was, there's the chance of success would not be nearly as high. But you need to come in and there's strategies associated with that. For example, with myself, I don't make any changes for the first 3 months. Okay. There'll be others that will argue against that. They'll say that your 90 days is your grace period where everyone gives you an excuse to make whatever changes that you want. But the truth is, you don't really necessarily know what the long-term effect of the decisions you're making is until you've been involved enough to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, how it fits into their business model, how it drives business objectives forward, and then structuring everything so that it actually supports those. I view the organization that I do as support operations and IT. And that's the whole idea is we are support operations. We support the operations of the company. The operations company is our customer. We treat them as our customer. We structure everything to support them to accomplish their goals as our customer. I even have SLAs associated with my team for how we respond and work with our internal staff because they need to be viewed that way in order to have it function really well. Yes, we're one team. Yes, there are some exceptions. Some things don't necessarily play out that way. But that mindset and changing the policies and procedures to support it and restructuring to support it is really what does it after you wait that grace period to fully understand how those decisions implications are done on the company as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean that during that first 90 days, you don't come up with plans. You come up with all kinds of plans. In fact, you probably are going to come up with plans in the first week or two that you get there. Right. But you need to continually look at and refine those plans over that first 90 days so that they become what's really needed by the company.
You brought very interesting point, Rob, because it's a human nature whenever we assume a position or a leadership a responsibility to refrain or be able to control that emotion, not to make changes. Because human nature is to go and see that I am going to revolutionize this one. I'm going to make change so drastic that it will be on the war footing now. But instead, you are taking a stance, let me observe and digest this first. Because there is a reason why certain company, certain organization operates in a certain manner. First, let me understand and then come out with my way of, not my way, but the way to take this forward, which is a very pragmatic approach. I think really, yeah.
I would argue it has a much higher success factor as well, which is why I do.
Right. And you mentioned that IT actually supports operations, and operations, in fact, is a customer for IT. But on the other hand, you also head operations. This probably goes back to not a conflict of interest, but in a role where you are answering to yourself. When a part of you is not very happy with other part of you, how are you able to handle this?
Well, it doesn't happen very often.
Okay.
And there's a little bit of a misnomer in the way I say operations, because there's two kinds of operations. The operations that I'm responsible for, which I do refer to as support operations.
Okay.
And then the operations of the customer, which goes out and directly supports the customer of the company. Being that we're primarily an engineering company, we refer to them as engineering a lot. But in a lot of other companies, let's say if we were a manufacturing company, they would be referred to more as operations. And then you would have operations and support operations. It's two different operations staff. The operations of the company, or engineering in our case, is the main one that we're viewing as our customer and the main one that we're driving to support, because then we're supporting outcomes for the organization. We're supporting revenue growth. We're supporting happy customers from the outside. We're creating all of the things necessary to make sure the company is successful. Now, there is a little bit of layover there where the IT and the security teams and the compliance teams and the support operation teams are supporting each other. I handle a lot of that by just regular weekly stand-ups. I bring all of those teams together into a single room. If anything comes up where they're trying to work with each other, it's discussed openly right there amongst the entire teams. And we work things out in those regular cadence meetings. It also develops the relationships between those teams, which tends to make those kinds of situations happen a lot less often.
Right. And what role does CIO plays in IT services organizations when it comes to sales and customer front ending? Because normally CTOs and delivery teams for customers take care of that. Do you also get involved in those areas?
Not directly.
Okay.
The way that we're involved is by making the process smooth, by making the process easy, by making it when they come back with a customer request, they can almost immediately turn around because the technology and the support operations are giving them what they need, either immediately at their fingertips or in a very timely manner. So we're creating the environment necessary for the smoothest and best outside customer operations or communications that's possible. And that's how we're supporting that customer growth.
And from a tooling perspective, because customers may demand different set of tools, and you may have a lot of internal tools. And in the end, again, you may be responsible both for internal tools and customer engaging tools, right? Because you own the entire IT footprint that you're. Is it very complex that to handle different set of tools, or there is no such issue for you?
There really isn't that much of an issue. We run in an agile environment for some of our production. It just gets put into sprints and put into storyboards and put into epics, just depending on what's necessary.
Right.
I have regular stand-up meetings with the rest of the executive staff, including the customer-facing engineering leadership. And we'll sit down and look at everything that's in there to come up with priorities. Priorities will change on a somewhat regular cadence, depending on customer need. And as long as we're running that in a true agile environment where we're adjusting it as needed for a customer base, we never run into those issues so much. A lot of it has to do with setting expectations, delivering on expectations, and communicating appropriately and completely on what those expectations are. As long as you're accomplishing that, there tends to be less problems.
And between 2020 and 2023, I mean, during that, probably just before this stint, you worked for an airline which probably the first airline to come out profitable post-pandemic. Can you throw some light how, because most of the airlines were struggling, but most of the airlines are actually doing good now because it's all, there is a revenge vacation or revenge tourism going on now. But back in those days, everybody was afraid. I'm wondering how you could turn an airline into profitable during those tough years.
Well, I didn't have control of the entire thing. I could only do my part. But in that particular instance, I was in charge of security. I was the CISO for the organization.
Okay.
Which I will point out, starting on January 1st of 2020 as the CISO for an airline was not a good particular scenario when I look back at it.
True.
But the whole point there was structuring everything so that we were spring-loaded. We saved the issue that we needed. We got everything ready to pounce. And as soon as we could actually move to make profitability, we moved, and as fast and as quick as we could. In the instance for myself, we had to constrict because of what was happening, or coil the spring, if you will, if you go with the analogy still.
Right.
The company wanted layoffs in order to accomplish this, which can accomplish that particular goal. I had some issues with that personally because I was running a security staff, and security personnel are some of the most highly trained, the most intricately trained, and the hardest to generally replace, especially because of the complexity of all the interconnected security systems with the way the business operates. So in this instance, I figured out how much money they were trying to have me save. And instead of shedding people, I started shedding AIs and MLs and automation utilities.
Okay.
On the net of the risk to the company, it was still the same.
Okay.
If I had kept all of those with fewer staff, they would have only been able to respond to a few, versus if I got rid of them, I'd have my staff be doing more of those manual labor exercises, but the total risk to the organization because of the downsize was equivalent either way. But I was losing machines instead of people. And then when we got to a point where we could spring the spring and we could move forward and we could pounce on a particular situation, it's significantly easier for me to start turning MLs and AIs and automation on than it is for me to start backfilling previously let go workers. And this put us in a position where we could take advantage of that.
Would you do it the same way if you were to do it one more time, given the whole automation hype and boom and what is going on?
Absolutely. I would absolutely do it the same way. It has nothing to do with hype. It has nothing to do with the boom. It has nothing to do with what is necessarily the most effective to really run the program. You're talking about an extreme situation because of an extreme world event and how to appropriately pivot and adjust it, putting yourself in the best position possible to take advantage of the recovery once you get out the other end. At which case, the booms, the hypes, none of it makes any difference. You're really looking at the company, what the resources are that are available, how the business model can be supported, and what you can do to accomplish that spring back as fast and as quick as possible.
Amazing. And it's not so easy also to take such decisions because there could be questions raised from CEOs and the board
Oh, there definitely was. I had to go through a huge PR campaign. It
Right.
was like I was on a political roadshow trying to get it so that people would get behind my decision that this is what needed to happen for this department.
Exactly.
The biggest point showing is that financially, we're still
Mhm.
accomplishing all the goals that they're asking me to do. It just it's hard sometimes to get out of that mindset of we're downsizing to accomplish it when there's potentially other options that have better long-term results that you could be looking at given extreme circumstances.
Mhm.
Now, having a pandemic starting is completely different than a slump in the market. A slump
True.
in the market would require a completely different way of addressing that, even though the pressure would be the same kind of pressure. And that's where that managerial difference to understand that and to be able to communicate it and sell it to senior staff and the board of directors for what your plan is and why you're doing it becomes important.
Yeah, and probably a few years down the line, when you look back, this could probably an instance where you feel proud about yourself because you put people and process ahead of machines, if I may say
I
so.
did. I
Yeah,
did, and it does give you some warm and fuzzies, but at the same time, it was also what was in the best interest of the business to do it that way.
right, right. And the top 100 CISO recognition, was it for any specific year instance, or it was more career uh, holistically?
It was more career holistically for all intents and purposes. I
Okay.
was a CISO for a decade before I came into becoming a CIO and a COO for my current organization. I wanted the increase in responsibility. I wanted to be more involved in the strategic operation of the company, which is
Mhm.
why I had moved out of those roles. But I had been a CISO for family-owned private companies. I was a CISO for the Arby's restaurant group at the time, owned by private equity. I was an interim CISO at UTC, or UTC Aerospace Systems, when they were doing their merger with Rockwell Collins, which is a huge public company. And
Mhm.
then I was a CISO for Allegiant Airlines, which was
Yep.
the airline that we were talking about, which is another decently sized public company. And across all of that, there is all kinds of things that have happened, including the fact that I was the one who navigated Arby's through their major credit card breach back in the day when it had happened.
Hmm. If you could throw some light, what happened exactly, Rob, there, and how did
Well,
you?
I mean, the exactly's get a little fuzzy because there's lawyers that get involved and you can't get into too many details of the exactlys. But the major one from a business standpoint is we were the first company to respond to a breach using a dual investigation strategy, which is a strategy that I had come up with and I had prearranged some of the concepts for doing it before the breach had happened at the company.
Hmm.
So the way this functions is we had a breach that happened. It's PCI related. They require you to have a breach response team through them, which we did. So we hired them and through them and had them do their stuff. But we narrowed their scope to the minimum possible need that compliance required us to have them.
Hmm.
And then I had my legal department arrange a breach response between the legal department and another entity that entity then had full access across my entire company. And it was a contract that was done between our legal department and them, not myself and them. And then the legal department then designates me as their representative for the purpose of running the breach response. So then I'm working directly with them at that point. The entire investigation we do primarily through the breach response that we did on the second one through the legal department. And then we continue to keep an almost zero scope or as close down to a scope as possible for the one that's mandatorily required. We get through the entire incident. We respond well. I believe the FBI at the time said we had the fastest remediation time on record after they had notified us, which was an interesting little factoid in there. But the main one is every single piece of information that happened through the investigation that came through the second breach investigation through the legal company was 100% protected by attorney-client privilege and was not discoverable in a court of law. And the only thing that was discoverable was the smaller minor response that we had done mandatorily through PCI using a different response vendor, which created a significantly lower liability for the organization, as well as significantly less discoverable information. And in the long run, protected the company from significantly higher fines than they would have gotten otherwise.
Right. Right. So fast forward by few years, Rob, you have seen how the technology industry has been shaping up. We have seen pandemic. We are seeing post-pandemic. We have seen remote work, hybrid work, a lot of back to office, many things going on. And then there is this AI, Gen AI, automation, all these things. If you put all these things into perspective and fast forward 5 to 10 years from now, what do you think will this new tech impact jobs as it is being seen, or we will partner with the machines and work together? What's your view about that?
Well, there's a short term, a mid-term, and a long term that's associated with all of this.
Sure.
The first of the short term is just going to be adoption waves.
Okay.
It's going to be people getting used to it. It's going to be people becoming more productive. The people that become more productive and get used to using it are the ones that are going to get promoted more. You're going to see them rising through the ranks. That's the trend you're going to start seeing. From the midterm, what we're going to end up seeing is what I call a slower position growth model.
Okay.
So as people become more effective, we're not going to remove jobs in place of AI or ML or anything of that nature. But as the company grows, we will be adding less jobs than we would have potentially otherwise had we not had that technology.
Okay.
So over time, you end up having less people in the roles that are being considered as the needs escalate because they can accomplish more through the use and the assistance of the AI.
How will that position our next generation? Because this long term, because I agree with you, very interesting perspective on the short term. Who couldn't use the technology effectively will rise through the ranks. And then the medium term and long term effects will take place. But by then, our next generation will probably be in the search of jobs or be in the jobs. What's your view that if most of this is automated and there is less and less effort required, manual effort required from humans, will it put us in a situation where we don't have nothing much to do?
I mean, there's always going to be something to do. The same argument was made back when assembly lines started becoming robotic.
Yes.
And it's not that there isn't stuff to do. It's just stuff changes. The stuff that you do is different. And that will happen on as far as that long-term perspective is concerned. There will always be place for innovation. There will always be place for free thought.
Right.
Every single one of these tools cannot do the job on their own. They just make people more effective. They have to be reviewed by people. They have to be put into context. When they create product and material, they don't have the context for its creation. So there always has to be edits and changes. We use it a lot to assist our development people. We've had probably close to 40% increases in productivity for people that have really gone in hard on its use, primarily because they ask it to do small snippets of code or database calls or basic common things that they can ask it to do and then throw into the code so they don't have to program the whole thing out. But every time they do it, they do have to edit that code and they have to look through it for errors. And the reports we're getting back is on average, they generally find 1 to 3 errors in the code that have to be corrected before they're actually put into their code and get compiled.
Right.
This is pretty consistent across all functions that we're using AI for. So if you're using AI for more of a letter, there's probably 1 to 3 errors in there that you need to read through and figure out how to change and make more appropriate to what you're doing because it doesn't have the context and it doesn't have those pieces. So you can't really use it to replace people for that function. So they're always going to be there. And it happens significantly faster when you're doing that editing than if you were generating it yourself. And that's where the productivity and the escalation of productivity is coming from. So those roles will always be needed, but they're going to start becoming more competitive. They're going to start becoming what's the extra piece that you can bring in than you can add? What's the special sauce that you can bring to the table when it comes to this type of thing? How can you innovate? How can you change it? How can you push it forward? How can you make it more effective? And those parts are going to start becoming significantly more important than how much code can you crank out? How well can you meet your sprint sites? That's going to become a little bit less because even with a little bit of training, people are going to start escalating on their capability of producing code at really exceptional rates.
Yeah. Just another thought around the same topic, Rob. For the examples that you mentioned, there are on an average 1 to 3 errors in code or 1 to 3 corrections to be made in the content. This is because this Gen AI is probably less than 2 years old. As it evolves the next versions and it becomes very smart, there could come a day in a year or two that I just ask AI, can you type a mail to Rob? And this is the context. It can even type, and I don't need to even check. It can even send. So when that in that world where we don't need to even review and correct, the situation, won't you see with the whole demographic changes going on also, that there will be many knowledge-based workers will be put out of job? Because I read one sentence somewhere, very interesting sentence. I don't want Gen AI to do the creative work and make me do wash my clothes. Instead, I want AI to take care of washing my clothes and cleaning utensils so that I go and do creative work, right? So what's your perception? Because when it becomes smarter and smarter, and I don't need to even review and correct, then we'll be in a situation not to have a lot of work.
My general perception is that it won't get there.
Okay.
I'll say it doesn't have the context of the situation based off of the prompts that you're creating,
right,
to give you something that doesn't need to be edited. Now, once it gets smart enough and once it gets developed enough, you could give it that context in the prompt that you're writing. Right. But the amount of information you would be writing into the prompt to create what you're creating is going to be pretty close to what you're just asking it to make and to begin with, in order to give it everything that it would need to make it perfect. In which case, now you're operating slower than if you'd used a less accurate prompt and just done the edits that you wanted to it.
Agree. Yeah.
Now, there is a tipping point there, depending on the amount of content that you're talking about.
Yeah.
If we're talking about one-page emails, if we're talking about code snippets, this is always going to be the case. If you're wanting to, say, write a 200-page quote response, right, then yes, you might spend a good amount of time writing a 2-page prompt to make sure that it's accurate. But now you're saving time just because of the amount of content that's coming out of it. And those paradigms are always going to exist, which does kind of lead to a new sort of skill set / role coming out there within prompt engineering. But a lot of it just depends on the amount of content you're doing and the amount of effort to make it perfect that will always be necessary by AI.
Very interesting. And when it comes to the whole world of work that is going through profound transformation, we never thought that such a huge population, working population, could work remotely and still be productive and successful, to the effect that the world accepts remote work as a possibility, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I say yes and no.
Okay.
I agree with half of your statement.
Sure.
They can definitely do it and be productive.
Okay.
While they can do it and be successful is going to depend on your definition of successful.
Fair enough.
So if successful is they can keep their job, they might get regular iterations of promotions within it, but they're kind of doing the same thing that they've always been doing for the rest of their lives, then you're completely correct. If that's your definition of success. If your definition of success is moving into leadership, becoming part of more of the strategic decisions of the company, getting involved in the business outcomes and where we go and what the organization does, at-home work is going to hurt you because you are not building the relationships with the rest of the management and the senior teams of the company to show the business is a trust game. And trust is very difficult to build on a fully remote system.
Yeah, makes sense. No, agree totally. But at the same time, the key people, the decision makers, strategists, the core group of the company is a smaller group compared to the rest of the working population for any company.
Yes.
And that population, if it is outcome defined, result defined, and this is what I'm expecting, and I approve your work provided you deliver this result, that working population could probably remote because it doesn't matter where they're located.
Correct. They can produce and they can accomplish and they can be effective in a remote environment. What they're going to be missing is that ability to receive promotions, that ability to change job classes, that ability to advance their career in different ways that they potentially might want to do, other than just showing results in the same thing that they're doing and escalating on that single path.
Okay.
That is still potentially possible, but everything else, all those other realms, all that other piece, that's what's really missing in that part.
Makes sense. No, agree. Uh, we have a philosophy at our company, Rob, because we are trying to connect the dots backwards and then connecting dots forward. Is in the human evolution, right? In life 1.0, we were all hunter-gatherers. We woke up with the sun, hunted for food, ate and slept. Very primitive life. And in life 2.0, we moved near water bodies, wherever water bodies were available. And we mostly relied on agriculture, maybe some cattle and some small-scale industries. And in life 3.0, we moved wherever jobs and opportunities existed. You probably could be, I don't know where you are from and where you are currently, but I am in Bangalore because of my job. And most of the people move to cities because of the opportunities, right? And this is when Industrial Revolution, followed by information technology revolution, followed by internet revolution, all that happened. Cities thrived, traffic also thrived, right? And we believe we are at the end of life 3.0 and the beginning of life 4.0, right? And what we believe is life 4.0 will be governed by where people will want to explore the world, because technology allows us to connect from anywhere and be able to do the job, right? And this whole remote working revolution, we believe people will explore the world because that's what gives them excitement now, because it fills their life. And life will be on the move, work will be on the move. Kids even could study in different countries, not just 1 or 2 countries, and learn not only in school, but from different cultures, different people, different backgrounds, all that. What's your view on this philosophy?
Well, there is a financial barrier potentially to that happening, especially if inflation continues across the world as it has been.
Right.
The primary issue that comes up with that is, so we allow remote work. Everyone pretty much does, but all of it is more hybrid scaled for us.
Right.
And it is more common for it to be that way. So instead of the growth of cities, you're almost looking at more the growth of suburbs and outlying city areas, because people have to be able to get to that office, even though they're not commuting there regularly. They have to be able to comfortably get there, even if it's just once a month, without incurring costs that are substantial to do so.
Yep.
So, but then there's the rest of that month that we're talking about. So if you have to go into the office, let's say 2 days a month, you still have 20 some odd days a month, most likely, to be somewhere else. And as long as you have an internet connection and you have the ability to work during your time zones that are necessary, or even sometimes it's just getting in the materials that you need to have get in. You don't necessarily even need the time zone. Then that becomes a potential and a possibility. The biggest hindrance that's going to exist there is going to be broadband and your ability to effectively get on the internet to do your work. But there are multiple technologies out there now that are working on fixing that particular issue.
Okay. Yeah, no, totally agree. And it may be utopian world if I say 6 months in Bangalore, another 1 year in New York, 2 years in London, because we are thinking 20 to 50 years from now, probably that we may see that kind of a world. We don't know. Yeah. And recently, NVIDIA CEO told that please don't ask your kids to learn computer science because you will not have that much of work left. What would you tell your next generation to learn, Rob, having seen or seeing what is going on?
It's still going to be necessary for people to understand computers.
Sure.
It's going to be necessary to understand how they're programmed, how they work, how they function. They're going to need fixes and updates and double checks and auditing at different points in time to make sure that they are what they need to be. The massive push for having people in it is probably going to slump some over time as they become more effective as individual contributors.
Right.
Just because the amount that they're becoming effective isn't going to be the same as the additional amount of new things coming up.
Right.
So there will be a reduction there in that particular thing, but that doesn't mean that the role is going to go away.
Right.
If you like programming, if that's really what you want to do, then there's no reason not to do it. It will still exist. It's just if you're one of those people that's like, I want my child to do programming because I know for certain they're going to have a successful future, even though they may or may not like it, then yeah, okay, maybe you should be looking at something else potentially. It just depends on what your motivations are for going into it. It's not going to completely go away, but it's also eventually going to get to a point where it's not the situation where it is now, where there's not enough of them.
Probably, if we draw a parallel, at least in my experience in India, the number of civil engineers and mechanical engineers were way higher in our childhood or in our dad's generation. But they slowly came down, and then IT engineers went up. Now, probably that will take a plateau and something else probably will come up. We need to see what's going to be that. Yeah. As we close this discussion, Rob, would you want to say any final words on the technology, future of work?
Ultimately, everything that we've said here is speculation. It's based off of our experience, what we've seen, potentially what we could have seen in the future, the hints that we get based off of what we do, but it truly is just speculation. And ultimately, every single person should be making up for themselves from their own mind based off of their talents, likes, things that give them a warm and fuzzy inside, what they really want to do as far as how they want to work, where they want to work, and what they want to work with. Because as long as you're doing those, no matter what the results are of things that are coming out, you're always going to be ahead in the long run.
You brought a very interesting point. Those three terms, what somebody wants to work, from where, and with whom, are actually the central pillars of our platform that we have built. So that we keep bringing work to you because there is enough work, and you work wherever you want and what you want with whom you want. And we need to see how that will take shape. But yeah, totally agree with you. And having said that, thank you so much, Rob, for your time. Very, very interesting perspectives. We covered a lot of topics. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.